Mirrors that don't reflect. Harlan Pike took his coffee in a dented thermos and 3 slow breaths before the shift bell at the county yard shook the rafters. He never liked the bell. It had a sharpness to it, a tinny scold that made the thoughts in his head scatter. The yard sat on the edge of a second-growth forest, the kind that had been cut when his father was young and then left to knit itself back together. Beyond the chain link and the salt domes, the trees kept their own counsel, a dark fringe against a pale morning. He slid into the cab of the flatbed and let the engine come to its morning cough. The heater smelled of dust and mouse droppings. His vest lay folded on the bench seat beside him, the reflective stripes rubbed dull from years of washing in hard water. Around him, the other trucks grumbled awake, tailpipes sending out white breath that curled and thinned and gave itself to the cold. Fluorescent lights buzzed in the bay, where the air compressor clicked on and off like a metronome that could not keep tempo. Someone's radio leaked the low murmur of a farm report. Harlan watched the yard gate roll back on its track and tried to see the day as a clean slate. He had the corridor route again. The paper on his clipboard said so with a blocky stamp. Wildlife advisories, temporary closures, signage adjustments. The corridor had appeared in a rush, a cut path through the trees, bounded by wooden fences and brush piles, all of it framed as a good deed. Folks on the county board called it a humane measure. There had been meetings. There were handouts showing deer, foxes, and small spotted cats moving safely under the gaze of motion cameras. There were words about crossings and connectivity, migration and bottlenecks. Harlan had attended one of those meetings because his supervisor liked to see a body in a uniform in the folding chairs. He had listened with the careful face he used for anything that had come down from above. It was the way the path had shown up that sat wrong in his head. One week there was just a tangle of chokecherry and poplar edging the back of the yard. Then there were survey flags flickering in the wind like small tongues. Then a line of brush mowed flat as if a great animal had dragged its belly through the trees. The corridor ran from the county fire road to the creek, and then beyond, a narrow grammar of earth and fence and tamped gravel. The first morning it felt like a trick of light. By the third, it was as real as a ditch. He took the back road out of the yard, past the fenced dumpster where ravens hopped and argued. The truck's tires found the usual seams in the blacktop. The sky was a scabbed-over grey that would not admit to rain, not yet. He turned on the defroster and rubbed at a crescent of glass with the back of his sleeve. On his left, the forest, close enough to sense its damp. On his right, a tangle of wire, pallets, and a single green bulldozer that leaked oil in an old, patient way. Harlan set his coffee in the cup holder and eased into the morning. He knew his route so well that his hands did most of the work. There were signs to adjust along the county lane where the corridor met the road. Yellow diamonds with leaping silhouettes and the words slow and caution that always felt like prayers. He would check the screwheads for bite and the posts for give. He would pick up the trash that had gathered in the shallow ditches, the stale crusts of fast food wrappers, a torn grocery receipt with the ink half gone, a slim brown bottle whose label had long since shed itself. Then he would pull up to the chain across the fire road, hang the new notice, and look into the trees a while, listening to the small sounds. The sound that morning had a wet quality, as if the forest were swallowing. Harlan stood by the chain and listened. He could pick out the usual, a woodpecker pecking wrong wood, a squirrel scolding things only squirrels could see, drops from some high branch hitting leaves down below with a careful cadence. But there was a thread through all of it, a thin, steady whisper that did not change pitch or volume, as if the forest were running tireless through a straw. He took the notice from his clipboard, the paper smelling of solvent and damp, and fastened it to the chain with a zip tie. The tie clicked home with neat little teeth. The notice used simple words: keep to the road, do not enter the corridor, report unusual animal behavior to the county office. There was a number at the bottom. Harlan ran his finger over it and felt the raised ink. He did not think about the number, only about the way the letters sat on the page as if they had always belonged there. When he first heard the stories, he had smiled in the way he smiled when someone mentioned weather in a line at the hardware store. The animals were not right, folks said. The doe in the schoolyard had stood perfectly still while buses rumbled by, her eyes dull as pebbles. A raccoon had washed and washed a plastic twist tie at the creek until its paws bled. A dog had come home from a woodshed wander and spent the evening walking into corners as if there were other rooms there that needed to be checked. Harlan did not have the right kind of life for stories. He had a one-bedroom rental with thin walls and a refrigerator that clicked on with a thump and hummed with the uneasy tone of a man clearing his throat. He had a dent above his left knee that told him when the weather would turn. He had a closet where hangers scraped like small violins. He had a small spider problem in the bathroom that he did not bother to solve because the spiders kept the other bugs honest. He set the chain back in place, its links heavy and cold in his hands, and turned to face the corridor. The cut path ran straight, the way a sermon can run straight when it starts out sure of its point. The fence boards were new, all pale heartwood and sharp corners. The gravel was a harsh grey that still held the shape of machine treads. On either side, the forest leaned toward the cut, curious or jealous or resigned, it was hard to say. Harlan could feel the corridor as a presence, the way a closed room has a presence because of the air it keeps for itself. He spat into the dust by one boot and watched the wet spot darken and then lighten around the edges as it soaked in. A blue pickup rolled to a slow stop on the county lane. The driver's window slid down and Mrs. Greer from the post office leaned out, her hair in the same tight coil it had been in for as long as Harlan had known her. She did not wave her hand. She gave a chin lift, which meant the same thing, just with less effort. "You putting that sign up again?" she said. Her voice carried in the damp air like a nail dropped on a floor. "Hanging a fresh one," he said. He tucked his thumbs into his belt loops, a habit he tried not to notice himself doing. "They say it's safer," she said. "That's what they told us. Safer for deer, safer for folks. Safer was the word. You go look down there and tell me that's safer." Harlan looked down the corridor again because she asked him to. There was nothing to see but the long narrow of it, lined by new boards that would grey in a few months and then crack in frost. There was a feeling, though, something behind the eyes, like the early press of a headache. He could see no animals, he could see no people. "Looks like a path," he said softly. "Doesn't look like no path to me," she said. She drummed her fingers on her window frame. "Bobby saw a fox down there last night, said it moved like a puppet somebody had forgot the strings on. Went 3 steps, then 2, then none. Eyes like holes. Fox always looked like a little gentleman to me. This one looked hollow." Harlan nodded because he did not have anything better to offer. He told himself she was the kind of person who liked a story to have weight. She carried her stories like groceries that needed both arms. She put her truck in gear and rolled away, and he stood for a while after her taillights vanished, staring at the blankness that paths can have when you do not know where they go. The rest of the morning was what it was. He drove from sign to sign and put his wrench on the nuts, feeling the bite and listening to the pitch of his metal against the metal of the post. Each little turn its own small song. He pulled a plastic bag from a culvert, the bag slithering like a skin as it came free. He found a crushed soda can pressed into the mud, and he pried it up and snapped it flat into the back of the truck. The heater in the truck was fickle, warm when he did not need it, and cold when he did. He took a call from his supervisor about a downed branch near the school and made a note on his clipboard in block letters that looked like they had been made by a boy trying to impress a teacher. Somewhere around late morning, the sun made a half-hearted try at showing itself and then thought better of it. At lunch, he ate in the cab with the windows cracked. The sandwich had been made quick in his kitchen, 2 slices of bread like bookends, holding something he did not really taste. He watched the corridor through the windshield and let the bread dry on his tongue. After a while, he realized he had not turned the radio on. He did not want the voices. He wanted to hear the forest breathe. It was nothing, he told himself. It was a cut in the green, one more county thing in a place full of county things. The mind looks for patterns. It makes patterns where there are none. He had read that somewhere, or heard it from someone he had once cared for, though he could not bring up a face to go with the memory. He took a drink of coffee from the thermos. It had gone past hot, past warm, into a temperature that made him think of a bath left waiting too long. A doe moved along the far edge of the corridor, her body the same soft brown as the place where forest meets field. Harlan saw her out of the corner of his eye and then held very still, so he would not scare whatever this was away. She did not so much walk as place herself. One leg and then another, each step careful and thought through, the way a person crosses a stranger's living room in the dark. Her head was up, her ears were up, her eyes did not shine. They were matte and strange, the color of backed-up ditch water. She stopped and looked across the cut path as if she were waiting for a cue. Harlan waited with her and felt his breath move high and thin in his chest. After a long minute, she continued on, and the feeling he had had, the one that pressed at his forehead like a hand, let up just enough to let him know it had been there. He told himself it was no more than the deer, knowing they were watched, that animals had a way of taking on the emotion in a space. He started the truck, the engine catching with that brief panic it always had, and he took the rest of his sandwich in quick, dry bites. The taste in his mouth had the flatness of old coins. By afternoon, the county had sent a new advisory down to his phone. There had been calls about the corridor. In lieu of closure, increased signage presence and frequent patrols were advised. He would run the route again at dusk, which meant he could go home for an hour in between and sit on the edge of his bed and look at the wall where the paint had bubbled a little from some past leak. He did not do any of that. He drove until the light thinned and then parked where the fire road met the chain again, engine off, key in his pocket, vest zipped up to his throat. The forest in late day had a temperature that seeped through the fabric of his jacket, settled into his elbows and the soft place at the base of his skull. The whispering was clearer then. It ran along the corridor, steady, a kind of polite hush that never wound down or wound up. He thought of the downstairs neighbor in his old apartment, the woman who listened to self-help tapes in the night, the murmur of encouragement that seeped through his floorboards and into his dreams. The memory made the air feel heavy. He took his small flashlight and aimed it into the cut. The beam hit the fence boards and then lost nerve. The world beyond the light did not promise anything. A shape moved along the path just inside the fence, but it did not move properly. It seemed to remember motion and act it out instead of just doing it. Harlan held the light clear of it because he did not want to take an animal's last dignity from it. He saw a tail, a long one with a white tip. He saw the fur along a back laid down like wet grass. The creature paused, head lifted. The eyes again were that lipstick of dull water. Harlan breathed in, and the cold cut the roof of his mouth. He knew his own heart for a moment, knew the sound it made in the cage of his ribs. He did not think of anything to pray. When he finally drove away, the beams of his headlights chased themselves up the trunks of trees and then collapsed into themselves. He slept poorly. The refrigerator in the kitchen took on an opinion. It hummed and then coughed and then hummed again, a passive argument just outside his bedroom door. At some hour, when the night had forgotten it was night, he woke with sand in his eyes and the taste of copper under his tongue. His brain offered him a picture of the corridor drawn as a child would draw it. 2 straight lines, a rectangle at the end, a square inside the rectangle, a smaller square inside that, over and over until the pencil broke. He thought he heard the faintest of voices, as if someone had left a television on in another apartment and turned it very low so as not to bother anyone. He got up, went to the kitchen, and stood with his palms on the counter. The laminate had a peeled edge that caught at his skin. The days settled into the pattern that work makes. He checked signs, he collected trash, he noted the small changes that no one but the person who showed up every day would notice. He learned the look of the corridor in different weather, the way fog moved down it like a person who wanted you to notice how quiet they were, the way rain skittered on the boards of the fence, ran into the grooves and found paths down the posts as if it were mapping new rivers, the way the sun, when it could be bothered, laid a pale coin of light all along the gravel and then took it back. He felt himself thinning a little at the edges, like a man wearing a shirt one size too big, the seams not quite where he was. The village had opinions. Harlan overheard them in the line at the diner, in the break room, at the Quick Mart where the coffee was always just about to be fresh but never actually fresh. People said the corridor was a gift and a curse. They said the land did not want it. They said the animals were picking up some frequency humans could not. They said more quietly that the thing had cut through a place where old stories said not to walk. They said the path was a path to somewhere else that was not a place you could draw with your finger on a map. Harlan did not go in for old stories. He had a collapse and carry kind of faith. The bolt collapses around the thread if you turn it right. The truck carries you if you put gas in it and listen when it tries to tell you something. Even so, he found himself avoiding the end of the corridor where the creek turned. He told himself the footing there was bad. He told himself erosion could make a fool of a man. He told himself the light was poor in that bend, and his eyes had never been the same since that one summer where he thought he could weld without the right shield if he just squinted. He stayed near the gate in the open. Then came the call. Mr. Lawton from the dairy claimed his barn cat had lain on the sill and watched the corridor for an entire afternoon without blinking. He'd put his hand in front of the cat's eyes, and the eyes had not seen the hand. He had picked the cat up and kissed the top of its head the way old men kiss animals like babies, and the cat had turned its head as if its neck were on a hinge that bent only one way. He had put the cat down, and the cat had walked to the corner of the kitchen and pressed its nose to the plaster, as if there were a seam there that might open. Harlan took the report and promised a patrol at dusk and wrote his notes down with that careful boy hand. He passed by the house where Miss Laureen lived, the one with the porch that sagged on one side like a tired lip. She called to him even though he had not slowed down, raising one arm with a precise angle that said she did not care much whether he stopped or not. He did stop because it felt wrong not to. She met him at the gate. She had the kind of age that makes a person look as if they had been cut from a piece of wood with a good grain. She smelled faintly of camphor and kitchen heat. "You got no business with that cut," she said. It was not a scold. It was a weather report. "Your people went and put a road where a road had no right. Not every door needs a hinge." "The county made it," Harlan said. He wished he had not said the county, as if that meant anything. He felt like a man bringing a note from a child to a landlord. She looked at his face for a long moment in a way that made him think of a nurse checking a fever. "You have the look of someone who takes garbage home and calls it something else. Don't take it home." Harlan opened his hands a little, palms up. "I only hang signs and tighten bolts." "That's not the shape of it," she said. "Men get to telling themselves stories about tools and tires so they don't have to think about the door in the wall. You don't poke your head through every hole you find, you hear. Your head might not come back with you." He nodded because saying nothing was sometimes the only honest thing. He drove on. Her words rode with him. They made the cab feel a touch too warm, then a touch too cold, as if the heater had learned new tricks. That evening he parked again at the gate and let the engine tick itself quiet. The dusk had weight in it, the kind of weight that comes from wet leaves and the promise of frost hiding behind rain. He heard what he had come to think of as the corridor voice, before he had stepped down from the truck. It ran along the boards like a breath caught in a harmonica. He did not turn on his flashlight. He wanted his eyes to belong to the dark for a while. There were animals. They moved in and out of the cut like thoughts he could not quite hold. A pair of eyes, then a turned shoulder, then a tail with a white flag that did not switch, only hung. A dog with a collar that had lost all but one of its studs. A low shape that might have been a pig escaped from someone's pen, but moved with a deliberateness he did not know in pigs. Nothing rushed, nothing bounded. They went through as if they were liking the path without liking themselves on it. He tried to think what would make a living thing move like that. Noise, light, smell, some pitch in the air he could not hear. He thought of his old fridge again, and the way it thumped before it hummed. He had looked that thump up once, on a message board, where men with nothing better to do on a weekend argued about coils and capacitors. The words had made sense while he read them, and then folded themselves up like paper cranes when he looked away. He took a step closer to the chain. The chain was a modest thing. He could unhook it and slip past, and no one would know. If anyone asked, he could say he had to check the far end for downed fence boards. He could walk the gravel and feel the scrape of it through his boots and tell himself he was doing the job they paid him to do. He ran his thumb along the latch. The metal met his skin with a clean cold that felt in that moment exactly right. He did not go in. He stood there with the thought of it, which was its own kind of going in. He could sense the end of the corridor as a spot on his tongue, a taste he could not place. He could see, in the part of his mind that provided pictures unasked, a pallor at the end of the cut, something like a vertical pond. He heard the quiet of his own voice in his head saying, "Now, now, now," as if he were trying to time a jump into a slow-moving rope. He heard something else. It was not a voice, and it was not the whispering. It was a chorus of small clicks, spaced so evenly they might as well have been drawn on paper. He counted them without meaning to, and then stopped because he did not want numbers in this. It was better to call them a string of beads, sliding from one place to another. The sound went with the dusk. The dusk went with his breath. When he got home, he left the television off and the radio off and the light off, at least at first. He sat at the table with the salt shaker and the sugar in the little lidded jar, and his keys set down just so. After a while, he turned the fridge a degree from the wall, as if that might change its tone. The hum found a new note, a lower one that made his teeth thrum if he pressed his jaw together. He took a shower. The water ran tepid and thin. The steam rose in a weak curl and broke itself against the mirror. He wiped the mirror with his hand and looked for his face. For a second that stretched until the muscles down his back ached. He thought the face looking back at him was a stranger's face. The eyes did not grab. The mouth had a tilt he did not recognize. Then the mirror pulled itself together, and there he was again with all his ordinary wear. The two places on his jawline that always nicked when he was careless. The line above his eyebrow from the time a pry bar let go too fast. The faint weather of his skin. He stopped saying good morning to himself, not out loud, just in the small way he sometimes did as he passed the hallway and caught a glimpse. The man he knew, another day added like a paper slipped onto a stack. He slept in two pieces now. He woke in the darkest part of the night, with his heart doing that teachable rhythm it had learned in youth and stuck with out of habit. And he lay there and listened to the building make its noises. He rose before the light and stood at the window that faced the trees. The curtains smelled faintly of frying. He pulled them aside and looked at the black shapes. On the third morning of that week, there was a new sign at the yard gate. Instituted by the district office, no one to access the corridor unsupervised. Harlan traced the letters with his eyes and wondered if there was someone who truly believed the problem, if there was a problem, could be kept out by a line of text. They had bolstered the rule with more. There was a clipboard to sign out at the desk, and a set of keys for the chain that would need logging. He took the keys. The woman at the desk did not look at him when she slid the clipboard his way. The fluorescent bulbs overhead flickered in a way that always fixed itself just as the maintenance man arrived. He kept the pattern. He kept to it even when it did not feel like there was much of him left to keep it. There was a brittle strength in that, like the way thin ice can hold a small stone against sense. He ate where he always ate. He drank what he always drank. He said the same small things when spoken to and none when not. He parked his truck in the same angle at dusk and listened to the whispering that somehow had widened without getting any louder. He began to notice his own gestures changing. He would reach for a wrench and feel his hand break the motion into parts. He would step off a curb and pause mid-air as if waiting for someone to tell him it was safe. In the mirror in the locker room, he saw the set of his jaw had gone slack in a way that made him look a little simple. The thought made him angry for 2 heartbeats, and then the anger went away like a match pinched to embers. He told himself it was just the season. Late fall made everyone walk like they were thinking too hard about their own feet. One evening he saw a boy by the chain. The boy had the look farm kids sometimes have, boots too big and a jacket that had belonged to an uncle. The boy did not touch the chain. He stood and waited as if he had been told to wait and was waiting because he was a person who still did what he was told. Harlan stepped out of the truck and closed the door softly so the latch would not set off a sound down the corridor. He went to the boy. "You lost?" he said, because it was the thing to say. The boy lifted one hand an inch and lowered it again. "Heard them calls," he said. He had the kind of voice that had not settled yet into its own weight. "Keeps me up, like someone whistling for a dog, but not for a dog. You ever go down there?" "Not without a reason," Harlan said. The boy nodded, even though the words did not answer the question. "My uncle says there's a door down there. He drinks. He says a lot." "Your uncle might be right," Harlan said before he knew he meant to say it. The boy's eyes were pale, the color of dishwater left in the sink too long. Harlan wanted to take the boy by his shoulders and turn him back to the road. He wanted to tell him to go count the jars on his Mother S shelves and see if any had gotten light over the summer. He wanted to say a thing that would make the boy forget to come here again. "Go on home," he said finally. "Ain't nothing here that cares what you want." The boy nodded again, slow. He did not leave. Harlan waited with him a while, the two of them breathing. At last the boy shuffled back to the lane and took a path through the ditch grass that suggested he had walked it before. Harlan hung the keys back on their hook and told no one about the boy because he was not sure there had been a boy. He was not sure of much by then except the whispering, which he was very sure of indeed. When sleep came, it was full of water. Water hanging in sheets from trees, water running in little quilts over stones, water folded and stacked at the end of a narrow room where the floor sloped toward a drain no one had noticed before. He woke with the taste of steel in his mouth and found he had gritted his teeth so hard his jaw ached. He took slow breaths and waited for the world to show its edges. He made a plan in the way a man who does not trust plans makes one. He would walk the corridor end to end with a camera from the yard, and he would note what he saw. And then the seeing would be a thing he had done and not a thing that shook at the back of his thoughts every time he paused. He would speak to his supervisor about fencing at the far end if there was a gap. He would file a report with capital letters. He would put what he felt into language that did not permit feeling. He would not think of Miss Laureen and her words about doors. He would not think of mirrors. He checked out the camera, a stout thing with a strap and a battery pack that had a bit of tape over a crack. He logged the time. He showed the keys to the clerk at the desk, though no one had asked. He put his thermos in the truck and did not drink from it because he wanted all his senses arranged and polished. The sky had cleaned itself to a pale, polished spoon. The air sat close to freezing. A crow on a fence post shook its wings like a man shrugging off a coat he had put on too soon. At the chain, he stood a long time with his hand on the latch. He looked both ways on the empty lane because that was polite. He listened to his truck settle. He looked for the boy with the uncle and did not see him. He thought of Mrs. Greer with her coil of hair and of the way she said safer. He thought of the flattened soda can in the back of the truck and how it had a mild dent shaped like a boot heel. He lifted the chain and stepped through. The gravel had a way of talking back to footsteps that made you feel accounted for. Harlan liked that about gravel. It kept honest books. He set his boots down one after another, and the corridor spoke to him in soft chuffs. The fence on either side did not lean or groan. The whispering braided itself into his footsteps so he could not say where one ended and the other began. Under the smell of damp wood and leaf mold, there was a cleaner scent. The kind that comes from fresh-cut pine, new glue, the inside of a chipboard cabinet before it sees a pan. It made his mouth feel slick. He lifted the camera now and then and took the pictures he would need to make the report look right. Fence joints, no daylight. Board spacing, true. Gravel depth, adequate. Trash, none. He made his notes on a pad with a pencil he had sharpened that morning so the point was hard enough to dent the paper. He kept himself to the small work so that none of the larger things could tip him. There were tracks in the gravel, but they were wrong. He knelt and put his hand beside one set that might have been deer if a deer had dragged its hooves like a child too tired to lift his feet. Another track looked like a dog had paced and paced, turning circles and never finding the end of them. There were bird prints that went to the fence and then bunched and then did not come back. He swallowed, his throat clicked. Halfway down the cut, he saw a shape other than his own shadow. It was a buck, head lowered, antlers dulled with the grey of old bone. The animal stood with one foreleg a little forward, as if he had forgotten to finish the step. His eyes took Harlan in the way a mirror takes a room, without curiosity, without judgment, simply with fact. Harlan had grown up in a place where people had names for animals depending on the time of year, the marks of the season on them. He had looked at deer in 1,000 lights and seen 1,000 moods. There was no mood here. There was a vacancy like a hotel in winter. He held still, and when the buck did not turn or stamp, he eased past in a way that said, "I am only a shadow." He kept one eye on the fence for weakness and one eye on the animal. The buck moved his head as Harlan passed so that their faces kept a parallel line, as if there were an invisible door between them that he was bent on keeping closed. By the time he reached the bend at the creek, he had taken more breaths than he could account for. The creek gossiped to itself over the stones. The corridor turned with the water, the boards following the curve like ribs. The whispering had a clarity at the bend that did not seem possible given the breeze. Harlan lifted the camera and then lowered it because the viewfinder made the world feel far away. He wanted it close, if it was going to be anything. He could see now that the corridor did not end at the creek. It crossed it on a simple wooden footbridge, the boards new and a little proud. Beyond the bridge, the path ran straight again, the trees on either side holding their breath. Far farther than the far side, there was a pale suggestion of a rectangle standing between the boards at the very end, just where the eyes want there to be a finish. It had no frame he could see. It had the stillness of something that had no temperature. He thought of a pane, though panes ask to be set in something, and this asked nothing at all. He took one step onto the bridge. The board under his boot gave a small sound, the way a polite person does when you step too close in a line. He took another step. The creek below was clear as glass, and then not clear at all, the stones winking at him with slow blinks. On the far bank, a jay called a single note and then held it in its beak as if it were not sure what to do with it. Harlan kept moving. The whispering now had the quality of words he had once known in a language he had not spoken in years. At the far end, where the path met the rectangle, he stopped. He did not intend to stop. His legs gave him the order and then took it back. The pale thing stood, as if it knew about standing, as if it had practiced in dark rooms and was glad to be out. It reflected, but not the way a mirror reflects. It did not throw him back at himself. It laid out a version of the corridor, as if the corridor was still there beyond itself, continuing, going on into the idea of going on, until the very notion of distance wore itself out. There was a figure on that corridor. It had his height and his weight. It had his jacket and his vest. It had none of his life in its face. Harlan tried a sound. The sound did not come. His breath went out and did not come back as breath does. It went out and hung in the air between his mouth and the pale thing like a piece of damp gauze. He felt his tongue become too large for his mouth. He felt the backs of his knees loosen. He had a thought about Miss Laureen and how she had looked at him and seen a man who carried garbage home and called it something else. He had a thought about the boy with the uncle and the way some boys want a door because any door is better than the room they have to stay in. Neither thought stayed. They slid off him like rain off wax paper. The rectangle held him. It did not drag. It held the way bedsheets hold a sleeping body, the way a crowd holds a latecomer, the way fatigue holds onto the last working part of a person. He believed he could step forward and touch it, and he believed he must not, and he held both of those beliefs at once, in the same room in his head. Time stood in the corner and did not raise its hand. He saw himself in the pale thing, but the self he saw was not a man who would bend to pick up a coin he did not drop. It was a man who would move when something moved him, and stop when something stopped him, and look when something wanted looking at. The eyes were not his. They were wells where the boards of the fence reflected and went dark and reflected again. He raised a hand, or thought he did. The figure in the pale corridor did the same a breath before him. The whispering was not outside anymore. It ran along the sides of his head and through the soft places behind his eyes. It told him about a place that was the shape of this place and not this place. It told him about a path that used people the way a road uses rocks to keep itself from sinking into mud. It told him there are doorways in the world and there are doorways in the person, and sometimes the two get lined up like sights on a gun. He took a step back. The effort of it shook his chest. He took another. The rectangle did not move toward him or away from him. It stood. The figure inside it stood. He backed onto the bridge. He put one hand on the fence, the wood cold and damp and very much of the world he knew. He moved until the bend hid the end from him and the whispering fell back to its earlier polite murmur. He reached the chain with his hands shaking in a way he hoped only he could feel. He locked the chain and wiped his palm on his vest, though the vest was no good for wiping and left a smear anyway. The keys made a small clink as they settled. The evening was not yet all the way gone, but the world had decided it was enough light for the day. He climbed into the truck and sat for a long time without turning the key. His hands lay on his thighs, open, as if he were ready to receive something or lay something down. On his way back to the yard, he passed Miss Laureen's. The porch light was on, though it was not quite the hour when folks turned on porch lights. She sat in the chair that was hers. She looked at him as he went by and did not raise her hand. He went home and made himself stand at his mirror and look. His face was a thing he had to force himself to own. He watched his eyes. He kept watching them until they felt like someone else's eyes watching him. He slept with the radio on very low, a crackle of static standing guard against the whispering. In his dreams, a chain fell without sound, and a door without hinges opened only as wide as a breath. The next morning, the bell at the yard did its little scold, and the compressor clicked, and the fluorescent lights gave their tired buzz, and a raven hopped along the fence and dropped something shiny, and then picked it up again. Harlan signed the clipboard without looking at the line above his. He took the keys. The day had a thin skin of ice over it. He knew before the engine warmed that he was going back. He told himself the words he needed. patrol, fence check, sign placement, routine. He held those words in front of him like a tray full of dishes, careful not to let any slip. The corridor waited as corridors do. He could feel it waiting in the way his breath shortened as he turned in at the lane and the chain grew into view. He could feel it in his shoulders, which had crept up toward his ears. He hooked the chain and stepped through and told himself a report had to be thorough to be any good. He walked with the careful measure of a man, counting his own steps and weighing each. He did not stop at the bridge this time. He crossed and went on, the boards giving their little sounds under him, and then a larger sound, and then a smaller one, like a voice testing a range. He walked until the pale thing was close enough that he could see it did, after all, have edges. The edges were so clean the air looked embarrassed beside them. He could see a breath of fog clinging where the pale met the not pale. He could see his own hand lift, and his own hand in the not place lift, but that other hand was quicker, knowing his move a heartbeat before he did. He sent for the word he needed, and the word came. Mirror. The word made the thing manageable for a full 2 breaths. Then the word fell away. He reached out a hand because there was no other thing to do, and because his hand had learned to do things without asking him first. His fingers met a surface that gave like the skin of a drum, stretched new. His breath fogged a little shape on it, and the shape had no symmetry. His eyes filled with a kind of pressure that felt like tears, and felt nothing like grief. Behind him, something moved. He did not turn. The corridor does not like a person to turn, he thought. It wants a person facing ahead, a person ready to walk. He held his hand to the pale thing and kept it there until the cold in his fingers became a kind of blank heat. He took his hand back and rubbed his palm on his vest and left another smear he would not remember making. When he finally walked away from it, he did not know if he had been gone a short time or a long one. The world outside the cut felt too loud, as if someone had turned it up. He heard each crow as its own event. He heard his own footfalls start and stop. With a kind of studied effort, he reached the chain and hooked it slow and firm and put his forehead to the cold of the padlock for a count he did not count, but could feel. He drove past Mrs. Greer. She did not look up from her steering wheel. He drove past Miss Laureen. She nodded once, surprised and not surprised. He drove past the Quick Mart and the school and the church with the sign that offered a verse about fear that made him smile despite himself. He went home and turned all the lights on and put the television on and the radio on and the kettle on and stood in all that noise like a man standing in the shallows as a tide rises around his knees, not yet willing to admit anything about the tide at all. That night, the whispering did not need dark to be itself. It came at him in the space between the anchors of his day. It was there when he bent to tie his boots. It was there when he lifted the wrench from the pegboard. It lay under the hum of the fridge, like an undernote, and he could not tell if the fridge had tuned itself to the whispering or the whispering had tuned itself to the fridge. He held onto his work with both hands, and the work held him back enough to keep him standing. He told himself the plan had not been a plan to go back again. He told himself he was a man with a job and a head for small maintenance and a fondness for quiet. He told himself the best way to keep a door closed is to put your back to it and lean. But there was that matter of the figure in the pale corridor, the one that moved ahead of him, like a man who knows where you are bound to go and decides to arrive first, just to show you what the room will look like when you get there. It waited. He felt that, waiting the way a person feels weather through a healed break. The next day dawned with frost thick as salt on the truck bed. He took his thermos because coffee was a habit and habits give a day its shape. He took the keys because he had to. He took the camera because words alone would not serve. He took the same breaths he always took and found them smaller. He stepped into the cut and felt the corridor close around him like a hallway of a house he had never visited, but somehow knew he had lived in. He had one thought when the whispering rose, as if in greeting. It was the smallest prayer he had. It had no words. It was only a tightening of the belly, a narrowing of the throat, a wish that had the shape of home. He went toward the pale thing because it was the only thing before him, and because in some days a man's choices fit into the small cup of his own palm and do not spill over. He went because he could not imagine how not to go and still be the person who would know how to tighten a nut. To pull a bag from a culvert, to smile at a boy and send him home. The pale thing filled the end of the world again. It made him feel at once like a child with his forehead to a classroom window and like a worker with his hand on a machine he had not been taught yet how to start. He raised his hand. He felt the air on his palm change temperature. He stopped seeing his own outline in it and started seeing the outline of his own absence. He had enough of himself standing behind his eyes to feel fear, but the fear went through him like a wind goes through grass and left the grass standing the way it stood before. The scream that should have come did not. He had no sound to bring to it. He had only the body he carried, and the body knew how to stand and how to lean and how not to run when you were on a narrow bridge and there was nothing to be gained by hurry. He did what his body told him to do, which was to stand, and then to reach, and then to lean, and then to remember breathing. The pale thing offered him a corridor that had no end, and the figure in that corridor, that had his coat and his boots and his posture and none of his memory, lifted a hand again, half a blink before he did. And Harlan, not knowing what else was left to try, opened his mouth and let the breath leave and not come back. Outside the cut, the day carried on. The yard bell scolded new men who were late. The compressor clicked out a rhythm anyone could set his watch by, if a person set a watch by anything anymore. The ravens found what they wanted in the dumpster. In the village, the talk slid toward new corners and then slid back to the old ones. Mrs. Greer put a new roll of tape in her dispenser, and the sound it made as she tugged it free carried oddly far down the hallway. Miss Laureen stirred a pot and set a spoon on a plate and lit a candle she did not need for light. Somewhere, a boy lay in his bed and looked at the crack where the wall met the ceiling and did not sleep. The whispering went on, polite as always, steady as a fridge in an old kitchen, a house sound you stop hearing if you decide to go on living with it long enough. Harlan gave himself back to the world, obeying an order he could not recall hearing. He was standing at the chain with the keys in his hand, and the afternoon had bent toward evening without his permission. His mouth felt raw, as if he had been breathing air that had grit in it. The pads of his fingers hummed with a small, mean ache, the ache of a man who has turned a tool past the comfort of metal. He was alone at the gate. The whispering lay along the boards like fog that had forgotten how to lift. He signed the keys in and wrote his own name soft and careful, each letter a separate task. The clerk at the desk said something about staplers, about a supply order not coming in on time, and he nodded as if he understood the weight of that delay. The fluorescent tubes overhead blinked in a tired rhythm, and then, as always, remembered their duty. At home, the apartment greeted him with its narrow hall and the smell of heat, having sat without reason all day. The refrigerator clicked and thumped and settled into its hum, as if it too had been waiting at a gate. He stood at the sink and let the water run into the basin, his fingers under the stream. The water had a taste he did not recall tasting before, a flatness that made him think of a coin someone had rubbed smooth. He drank, and it did not do the thing water does. It lay in him like a guest who refuses to take off his coat. He went to the bathroom and looked at his face. The mirror gave him back what a mirror is paid, to give back no excuses, but there was a lag in it, a beat out of time, a stutter you might forgive in a new machine, except this was not new. He raised his hand, and the hand in the mirror raised, and for an instant he could not say who had moved first. He stepped back, and the light above the sink flickered once, as if someone had snapped his name without sound. He did the small work of evening, as a man learning his own house again. He set the kettle to heat and listened for the barely there whisper in its first thoughts. He opened the cupboard and counted how many mugs sat clean upside down. He tore a page off a grocery pad and made notes that had nothing to do with food, oil, batteries, tape. He made the tea and did not remember drinking it, and later could not say if he had left the cup in the sink or on the table, or if he had held it until it went cold, and then set it down somewhere out of sight. Sleep came in pieces. He found himself standing in the living room with his hand touching the cold glass of the window, his breath smearing a pale oval on the pane. The oval sat there too long. He wiped it with the heel of his palm and looked down at the parking lot where the trucks sat like sleeping animals. He turned the radio on low and spun the dial until the static had a tone that matched the hum in the refrigerator, and in the weaving of those two dull sounds, he found something akin to company. He dreamed he was walking the corridor with his boots filling slowly with water. The water rose past his ankles, past his shins, and there was no weight to it, and no chill, only the sense that his feet had become other things, tools, perhaps made to be handled by hands, not his own. He woke at the hour when the night thinks about letting go. His jaw hurt, and he knew from the ache that he had clenched it hard enough to grind two places that were not meant to meet. He went to work because that is what days ask. The yard bell did its small, sharp reprimand. The compressor found its rhythm. The radio in the bay told a story about a shipment stuck in a warehouse 3 towns over, and men he did not know clucked over it as if there were chickens tucked under their coats. The corridor lay where it lay, and the county had sent down a new notice written in the same voice as the old one, only with more words. The words said enhanced observation protocols and incident reporting, and tucked in the middle, where eyes might skip them, do not engage with animals exhibiting repetitive or unresponsive behaviors. Harlan circled that last line for no reason he could explain, and then left the circle without a note. When he took the truck out, the sky had been scrubbed pale by a wind that carried the cut smell of distant wood. He drove the line he always drove. He tightened the bolts he always tightened. He lifted 2 bags from the mouth of a culvert, and they gave that soft, sad sound bags make when they have been pressed into mud and then freed. He kept the radio off. The quiet in the cab felt full in a way quiet sometimes does when you are the only person to hear it. He passed the chain and did not stop. Not because he meant not to stop, but because his hands did not act on the small flick of his attention. His hands had practiced doing without him, and he let them, grateful and afraid. At noon, he went to the diner and took the stool he always took. The waitress who had served him 100 times did not say his name. She put the pad down and waited with her pencil ready. He opened his mouth, and a smaller breath than he expected came out. He said his usual, the words as thin as the paper they would be written on. She poured his coffee. He watched the brown and the steam, and for a second the coffee kept its shape as it left the pot. A ribbon that did not want to break, a thing learning to be a different thing. He blinked, and it was just coffee. And he lifted the cup, and the heat against his lips said, "Here is what you paid for." On the way out, he stood for a time by the newsstand and looked at the pictures on the front of the local paper without reading any of the captions. A deer, photographed by a game camera, stared past the lens, its eyes dull as asphalt. A headline offered the word advisory. Another offered partnership. The woman from the post office pushed past him gently, and he smelled on her coat the mailroom, that old paper scent baked into fabric by years of repetition. She did not see him, or she saw him and moved without the part of seeing that recognizes. He walked to the truck with his hand on his pocket as if there were something in it worth checking. The pocket held only the small folded paper where he wrote bolts and batteries, and nothing about what he wanted to write and could not. In the afternoon, they sent him to the school to look at a section of fence that began and ended without reason behind the gym. The wind had laid newspapers against it as if to dress it. He peeled the paper off with both hands. The ink had bled in the rain and came away on his fingers in a grey film. The janitor came out and stood with his hands deep in his jacket. He said something about kids, about the things they will try, about how bad weather makes them wild and good weather makes them wilder. Harlan answered with his shoulders, and then, because the janitor waited for more, with words that felt like blocks set one on another until they made a small child's fort that no one would go into. On his way back toward the gate, he passed Miss Laureen's house. She was not on the porch. A plant sat in the chair where she usually sat. Someone had set a jar beside it with a candle, winking at the world as if it were a thing that needed practicing. He felt the want to stop, and did not the way a man feels the want to lay down a heavy thing and carries it with two hands instead, and tells himself there is a proper place for putting it down. At the chain, he did not mean to get out. He found himself standing there with the keys again, as if sleepwalking through a door he had locked twice and tested once more, just in case. He took the chain down. He stepped inside. The air in the corridor had no temperature he could put a name to. He had laughed once on a long-ago job with a man who got fancy right before lunch about different kinds of cold. There was freezer cold, breath cold, pipe cold, and the cold of an empty room. This was none of those. This was the temperature of a space saved for later. He brought the camera because a report needs pictures, and a man can hide behind pictures in a way he cannot hide inside a paragraph. He lifted it now and then and let the lens take what it needed. The deer again, or a different deer wearing the same dead eyes. A raccoon sitting and then rising and then sitting as if some small spring inside had lost its tension. A fox with that white-tipped tail dragging along as if the tail had learned how to be a separate animal. The click of the camera shutter sounded like a door well oiled and frequently used. He had told himself he would not go all the way to the end that day. He had told himself the word limit, as if there were an allotment one could spend safely and then go home. He walked as far as the bend without deciding. The stream spoke low and continuous, a voice in a room behind a door, friendly and private both. He put both hands on the rail of the small bridge and pressed down, as if testing something chained that might be willing to give. He felt the wood hold him, and was briefly, utterly grateful to wood for being wood. Beyond the bend, the pail stood and waited. It reflected not the world, but the shape of promise that the world makes to itself when it lies very still and thinks about beginnings. Harlan stepped until he could see the figure in it again. There it was. His coat, his vest, his unremarkable shape, moved a small fraction ahead of him, as if time had lost its place and started the song from the wrong measure. He lifted a hand, and the figure lifted. He thought of dropping his hand instead, sharply, a trick, but the figure had thought of it first. He leaned. It leaned. He smiled without meaning to, a bare, thin line of teeth, and the figure smiled so small a smile you could only see it if you had known his face every day. It was a relief to be recognized and not recognized at once. He tried a sound, and the sound came, but it came inside his head, a shout that shook his own bones and never climbed into air. He tasted metal, the taste of a battery pressed to the tongue as a boy, to see if it had anything left in it. He placed his palm to the pail again, and it yielded again, and for a moment he felt he was pressing not against glass or air, but against a membrane that had practiced letting things through without tearing. On the way back, he saw the boy. He stood inside the fence line, 1 foot higher than the other, as if he had frozen mid-step. His jacket hung open, though the air had gone cool. His eyes had pinned Harlan once before, pale and attentive. Now, they did not pin anything. They were on their own business. Harlan paused. He knew the words to call a boy back. He had used them as a younger man, and a boy had done as asked, because sometimes boys do. He had the 2 words that can make a child turn. Hey now. The words waited behind his teeth, well worn and honest. He did not use them. He lifted his hand instead and showed the boy his palm, like a man showing he carried no weapon, and the boy did not blink or rock or run. For 2 beats, the corridor had the boy, not by force, but by turning him into a thing that cannot decide to move. Harlan stepped between the boy and the bend and stood until the whispering thinned a little in the boy's space. The boy's head tipped, the way a bird's head tips when a small scent it will never identify goes past. He did not look at Harlan. He looked at the place where the pail would be if you could see through a hill, and Harlan, not trusting his voice, clicked his teeth very softly as if he were signaling a dog, and the boy's head turned to that small sound in the same slow way water turns when wind changes. "Go on," Harlan said finally, and was relieved to hear there was still a voice in him that could go out and make air move. "Go on home." The boy went, not because the words were strong, but because the corridor let him. Harlan stayed where he was until he felt his own feet again. They brought a man from the district office the next day. He wore a jacket that had been cut to look like a jacket a man does work in, but had done no real work. He had soft hands and good boots, and he smiled in a way that asked the world to be reasonable. He asked Harlan to walk him to the chain and say what he had seen, and Harlan did. But his words found the small, polite phrases the district needed: unusual behavior, repetition, unresponsive silence. The man nodded, as if the words were water running down a glass, and he could tell how clean the glass was by the sound it made. "What do you think it is?" the man said, still smiling, the way a man might ask another man to guess how many peanuts are in a jar. Harlan thought of a door without hinges, and a mirror without glass, and a mouth without breath, and decided none of those would sit well in the man this afternoon. "Seems like the animals can't see themselves right," he said, "like their bodies forgot how to talk to their minds for a stretch." "That's good," the man said, and Harlan felt the phrase slide around his ankles like a looped cord coming off a spool with lazy precision. "Let's keep an eye on it." They set a camera on a post near the chain, pointed straight down the corridor. Harlan screwed a bracket into the board with mechanical relief, something biteable to put his attention on. The district man checked the angle, and the small red light winked its winking. The whispering did not mind being filmed. It had nothing to hide. At the yard, the new notices bloomed. Enhanced advisories, limited hours. The chain would be locked at a certain time and unlocked at another. The numbers looked friendly and blunt. He underscored one and studied the curve of the ink where it faded. He was tired without the relief of sleep. He could not find his tongue on some mornings where he'd left it the night before. He caught himself standing in a room and not remembering whether he had walked in or stood up from a chair to be there, and the difference felt like the whole of a thing. He went to Miss Laureen's on purpose, as you go to a person who has laid a clean towel over a chair in a room that holds heat. She was on the porch again, the chair back where it belonged. The candle in the jar had gone to a collar of wax. "You went through," she said, and her voice had no accusation in it, only the fact of weather. He stood at the foot of the steps like a man outside someone's kitchen at supper time. "I walked the line," he said, and then, because she kept looking, "I touched it." "You brought some of it home," she said. "Don't try to make it behave like the water in your sink. You'll only bruise yourself." "What is it?" he said, and his voice surprised him because of how quietly the words came out, as if noise might wake something sleeping in the yard. "It's an old wrong with a new coat on," she said, and then laughed a short laugh that had no joy and no meanness in it. "Lands don't forget, people do. You cut a path where the ground is keeping its secrets, and the ground says, 'All right then, I will put my secrets in a place where you have to look at them. You look at them long enough and they look back.'" He thought of mirrors again, and doors and breath, and none of those thoughts held still. "I saw me in it," he said, and realized as he said it that it was true in a way that did not require his agreement. "Only not exactly me." "That would be the hook," she said. "You're not built to ignore your own face, son. That's why men carry photos and take them again and again and say, "Look at me standing by this rock, look at me by this water, look at me." You find a look that isn't yours wearing your coat and you go soft in the knees. You think you can fix it by telling it how to be you. It can't hear that. It's busy in its own place, where you're the stranger. He wanted her to give him a trick. He wanted a word to say that would make the pale thing turn friendly or bored. He wanted a way to make the whispering stop without making all the other house sounds stop with it. He wanted a length of tape he could put over the seam in the world. He said none of this because the saying of it would make him sound like a man asking for his mother in a room full of men. "Stay out of it," she said. "Tell them boys to keep away. Pack your ears with cotton if you have to when the calls come. Keep your breath for your own life. That's all the advice I know." He nodded. He could say yes to advice easily. He had said yes to advice his whole life. He had said yes to advice that did not apply to him and made no sense and had been spoken just to fill the air. He said yes now and held the shape of the word in his mouth like a coin he might have to give back. He set himself to avoid the chain, and he did not avoid it. He found himself at the fence in the middle of the morning, a wrench in his hand he had not lifted from the pegboard with intention. He caught the deer tracks without trying, and the tracks drawn by something low without letting himself name it, and the small circles of bird feet that ended in the blur a wing makes when it remembers something about flight, and does not like that the remembering asks for such force. He sent his hands to pick trash from the fence line, and his hands came back empty and straight, and tried again. The whispering did not ask anything of him. That was part of its danger. The days around the village took on the shape that talk gives a place, when talk cannot fix anything. A sign at the Quick Mart asked people to keep pets indoors, and please do not call the store to report sightings. Call the office at the number below. The meat counter at the market had a note about supply. A bus went past the yard with its windows all showing a single thin face reflected, and Harlan watched it without knowing if those faces had matched anyone sitting inside. Mrs. Greer put a stack of misrouted mail on the counter at the diner, and men thumbed it as if paper could comfort their hands. The school put new lights around the lot that made the asphalt look like a stage, and the children going to their parents, cars like actors who could not remember lines. One night, the power went out for a wide stretch between the highway and the creek. It went not with a pop, but with a sigh, as if the street had been waiting to exhale. Harlan sat at his table and felt the sudden quiet lay itself against his skin. The refrigerator died with a small click that sounded like the end of a sentence. He could hear neighbors murmur through the wall and then stop, the way voices stop when a person looks up and tries to hear the sky. The whispering filled the room like fog rolling over a low field. He lit a candle and set it down and watched the flame find its height. And for a moment, his own shadow on the wall leaned and did not correct itself, and the moment widened and then closed like a camera shutter. He slept on the couch with the radio by his ear, its batteries throwing him a steady, uncomplicated hiss. The corridor dreamed him instead of the other way around. He woke with his mouth open and his breath gone somewhere he could not follow without standing, and he did not stand. He closed his mouth and laid the edges of his tongue against his teeth to feel that he had teeth. In the morning, he went to the yard, and the bell was silent and the compressor without voice. Men stood in small clumps in the bay, their hands finding reasons to hold things: an extension cord, a broom. The clerk wrote by daylight at the desk with a pen that did not need a cord to warm it. Harlan signed his name, and it looked like a note left by a man passing through a station to a man waiting for a train that would not come. He took the truck and the chain keys and the camera, because when the day has taken its shape from habit for long enough, a man becomes the shape as much as the day. The corridor took him again, in the same easy way a narrow sidewalk takes two people down a block, one slightly ahead of the other, because the front person chooses a pace and the rear person does not disagree. At the bend, the pail waited, and he went to it, as if he had told someone he would meet it there. He placed his hand on it and pressed. The other hand pressed, the one wearing his hand like a glove, but it knew when he would move before he did. He thought of a boy pressing his palm to a window on a school bus to see if the fog the bus made with its breath would gather at his fingertips. He thought of that boy learning the word static and then learning other words that made too big a promise. The pale thing was not a promise, it was a fact. It did not want him or not want him. It allowed. For a while he brought back small marks. His palm put a faint print on the surface, and for a breath he saw the mark, as if the pail had a way to hold the grease of him. He wiped it away with the side of his hand, and the wipe left no streak. He pressed the gunmetal head of a bolt to it, and nothing in the pail gave any sign it noticed the cold shape of metal. He wanted to throw a rock and felt foolish for wanting it. The way a man feels foolish for needing to test what he knows he will not like the answer to. He resisted the shape of that test with effort he could feel in his calves. On a day with rain sitting in the air like someone else's breath on the back of his neck. He set the camera low and aimed it along the boards to catch not the pail, but the place before the pail, the place where movement without purpose made itself known. He let the camera run while he stood outside the cut and listened to the steady hiss of tires on wet road and the drips off the brim of his cap. He checked the camera later in the truck, the screen small as a cigarette pack, the images small as a thought. The animals slid along the gravel like pieces moved on a board by a bored child who had forgotten the rules and did not want to admit it. Twice, 3 times, he saw a figure at the very edge of the frame. Not an animal, a coat he knew, a stance. He scrubbed the video back and forth with a finger, and each time the figure came a beat before Harlan's own movement. He put the camera down on the bench seat and did not look at it again that day. He tried the old tricks men use to fill a body back up with itself. Long walks not toward anything, a hot bath with a towel folded just so, on the radiator a radio talk show where a host laughed exactly the same way every day at exactly the same place in a story. He fixed a loose hinge in the kitchen, and the tiny satisfaction of alignment moved through him like clear water moving through a pipe that had been bellied and then leveled. He oiled the lock on his front door and turned the key in it slow and sweet, and found the turn so right he did it again before catching himself. He bought a bag of nails and poured them into a jar because jars of nails belonged to a life like his. He set the jar on a shelf and watched the nails settle, their small clicks running through the glass in little chains. None of that kept him from the chain. He went without thinking and then thought about not going, and then stood and held the keys, and the keys felt not like keys to anything a person ought to lock or unlock, but like tokens a man might hand over at a booth where a game is being played he has forgotten the name of. One evening a fog came in off the creek and lay along the corridor like a patient animal. Harlan stepped into it and found that it carried a smell he knew from his job years back when he had helped gut a storage building. Old insulation, damp cardboard, a sweetness under rot. He walked the center of the gravel because the edges had lost their crispness and he did not trust his memory of them. The pail at the end was both nearer and less distinct, the way a thought is when you wake from a dream and it holds you by the tail and then lets go when you turn to look at it. He went to it anyway. He could feel it in his molars. He touched it, and the fog moved around his arm in a way fog does not. And when he pulled his hand back, his sleeve was dry. He stood with his palm hovering an inch away, and could not tell if the tingling in his skin came from the pail or from his wanting there to be something to explain what he had chosen to do. He had never thought of himself as a man who chose much. He had always been the person who took what the day set in front of him and made that thing work, and there was a rough pride in that. Now the day kept setting this in front of him, and he kept making that work, and the fact of it made him tired in new places. He pressed his forehead to the pail because there is a way to break a spell by doing something foolish, and he was just enough of a fool to try. The cold came in particular places. The ridge above his left eye, where the skin had a thinness to it. The heel of his hand, where old callus had softened the corner of his mouth, where years of holding a small grin had put a dent. He felt he could put his face through if he turned it just so, if he found the angle with the muscle memory that lives in a man's neck from years of remembering to look where he's going. He did not try. He stood until the want to do so went out of him, not all at once, not in a flourish, but like a pot cooling on a back burner when the stove has been turned off and no one is watching. Behind him, the boy's voice came small and practiced. "Mister," the boy said, a single word carrying the weight of a dozen that he had decided not to say. "Mister, you're not supposed to be there." Harlan turned, and the fog smudged the world like a fingerprint pulled across glass. The boy stood a few steps back from the bridge, his eyes reflecting nothing Harlan could see. The collar of the boy's jacket had unfolded and lay flat in a sad way that made Harlan's throat try to shape a promise it could not keep. "You go on," Harlan said. "You go on and do the things that belong to your life. Leave this be." "Uncle says it sings," the boy said. "He says if I listen, I can learn it. He says some things you only get where you get 'em." Harlan could not find a single true thing to say that would fit in the size of that boy's ear. "It doesn't stop singing once you learn it," he managed. "Might be that's the trouble." The boy put his hands in his pockets and took one step backward, more a tilt than a step. He looked over Harlan's shoulder at the place where the world ought to have the courtesy to stop, and then, as if whatever ran inside him had found a new gear, he turned and went, not running and not dawdling, just moving away with the same slow commitment with which he had moved toward. In the days after, the calls to the county office multiplied in the way calls do, when people cannot tell the difference between what they know and what they think they saw. A man said he had watched a line of opossums cross his yard and then come back and cross it again, and he had not counted how many because numbers felt like an insult to whatever that was. A woman said her dog had looked behind her for a time so long it had felt like a punishment, and then, when she reached back to lift his chin, he had snapped at the space an inch to the left of her hand, as if the air there had made a gesture that offended him. A boy, Harlan knew which boy, did not call, but someone called on his behalf to say he had been walking in his sleep. The district office sent more men. They strung a second chain. They posted a schedule with hours that had no reason to them other than the comfort of writing something down. They put up a camera at the far end of the corridor too, on the other side of the creek, in the trees pointing back toward the pale, and this was a trick none of them admitted to thinking clever. Harlan checked their work and did not tell them the lens on that camera would fill with a fog that had nothing to do with weather. He watched the footage in the yard office at a metal table with coffee that had boiled in the pot until it had grown itself a skin. The screen was slow and the frame stuttered, and that suited the subject. In one piece of footage, a buck stood at the far end, head lowered, and on the surface of the pail, a shape appeared that might have been the buck, but taller, stretched as a reflection stretches when the glass tries to be water. In another, for a handful of seconds, a man in a county jacket approached the pail, and the man in the pail approached a beat ahead of him, and the man watching them on the screen placed his hand flat on the table and did not look at his own fingers because he did not want to see whether they moved before the idea to move. The clerk at the desk began bringing in a small fan. She set it to one side and let it spin, not because the day was hot, but because the sound of its blades cutting the air gave the room the kind of sense that keeps a person from naming a thing out loud. People are afraid of names when names might stick. The boy did not come back that Harlan could see, and this should have eased something in him. It did not. It left a smaller, sharper ache, like a hangnail pulled too close to the quick. He tried to stay out of his own mirror, and then forced himself to use it, because a man who will not look is a man who has left himself behind. He shaved, slow, conscious of the place under his jaw where he had nicked himself so many mornings it had scarred into a little pale comma. He watched his own eyes and felt a beat in his throat that did not match the pulse he had come to trust. He lifted his chin, and for a heartbeat the mirror found another face to try on his bones, and then, as always, returned him to himself. It would be better if it were dramatic, he thought dryly at his own reflection. It would be better if the lights flashed, or the glass cracked, or his breath blew cold on his own cheek. It would be easier to fight something that did not insist on courtesy. He drove by Miss Laureen again, and this time she spoke without leaving her chair. "You won't win wrestling with it," she said. "You feed it, and it will get gentle with you. Then you'll call that gentleness a favor. You'll be wrong." "What did the ground keep to itself?" he asked suddenly, and his own voice startled him, its urgency a surprise after days of narrow speech. She tilted her head just barely, as if something had moved above them and she was choosing to ignore it. "Old trade," she said. "Movement for movement. Lives going one way were asked to go another, against their own sense. The land marks that. It keeps the markers quiet until people go and make a new line over the old, and then all that old moving, all that wrong asking, finds a mouth. It speaks in the language you understand, doors, glass, your own outline." "Can it be shut?" he said. "It can be left alone," she said. "That is not the same answer, but it is the only one I know that does not taste like a lie." He did not leave it alone. He told himself he was checking the fence for a nail that had worked loose. He told himself he was making sure the signs had not blown down overnight. He told himself his job had the shape of going, and he took the shape because he was a man who took shapes and made them hold. He told himself a string of words, and the words lined up like men in a hallway, waiting to be told which door to go through. He thought once of calling someone he had not called in years, a woman whose name he did not let himself say, so he could keep the room in his head where she sat tidy, untouched. He imagined her voice, the way she had said his when she was tired of using it and wanted something else said instead. He imagined her patience with the nonsense he had to bring her. He imagined her silence the whole time he spoke. He did not call. The refrigerator hummed. The radio at low volume made a carpet of sound so thin it wore through where the day put its foot on it. The last time he went to the end, he did not know it was the last. Such times never announce themselves. The air had a bright bite to it. The boards were a shade darker from a week of damp. The gravel gave good voice, a steady discursiveness under his boots. He walked with the posture his job had taught him, ready to stoop to pick, ready to lean to tighten, ready to stand to observe. The pail stood where it stood. He felt no panic and no peace. He reached out because reaching out had become the grammar of this exchange. Something in the pail changed, not its shape, but its willingness. He could feel it want less or want differently. His palm met it and his hand slid, not into, not through, but along. A face appeared where his ought to. The face had his bones and none of his history. The mouth opened a fraction of an inch before his own did. He tried to close his mouth and saw the other mouth close, and then, with dainty delay, felt his own jaw obey. He did not frighten easily, but he felt the kind of thing that frightens a man who has made a home inside his routines. The knowledge that someone else can move the soft machines he lives in. He pressed. The pail held. The corridor behind him waited, patient as a clock that has been wound and knows exactly when it will stop and how the room will sound when it does. He leaned his weight, and the thing accepted him as a door accepts the touch of the person who has always opened and closed it, and to whom it owes neither favor nor resistance. His breath met the surface and stuck to it again, a small white damp that drew itself into a shape. The shape was not an oval this time. It was a handprint, but the fingers had too many joints, and the print of the palm had lines that did not match a man's lines. Lines that did not tell a story a woman in a booth at a summer fair could read and laugh about later over onions. He removed his hand. He turned away, not quickly, because the corridor did not allow quick. He walked with a steadiness he did not feel. On the bridge, he stopped and looked down, and the water looked back up with no opinion. He returned to the chain and hooked it and wiped his hand on his vest and left a mark that would not wash. At the yard, he sat in the truck with the key in and did not turn it. He watched the thin seam around the glove box twitch with the vibration of a vehicle passing on the far road. He listened to the heater decide its position, then change its mind. He opened the glove box and took out the map that had come with the truck when it had been new and folded again. He unfolded it and spread it on his knee, and the crease marks had become part of the paper, small ridges like old scars. He traced the county fire road and the place where the corridor cut it, and his finger felt the shape of a path and brought it into his hand. He thought of leaving. He let that thought sit a moment, the way a man lets a small animal sit in his lap, with his hands hovering just above it, not touching but ready to catch if it leaps. He thought of a highway in the dark, and a diner 3 towns over with lights that flicker reliably, and a motel where the towels are too thin but clean, and a morning in a place where the whispering would sound like wind lost between buildings. He held the shape of that plan until it curled and cooled. He set the map back in the glove box and closed it, knowing he would never open it again without seeing his own hand on the pail and the print that hand had left. In the days that followed, he found himself doing what a man does when he knows he has not one choice but 2 that are bent toward the same end. He made his apartment neat. He put a clean shirt on a hanger and hung it on the makeshift nail behind the bedroom door, as if he was saving it for the kind of good day people do not get at his age without a cost. He took the jar of nails down and shook it lightly and listened to the little chain of clicks. He wrote his name on a scrap and put the scrap under the magnet on his refrigerator, then took it away, because that felt like a note a man leaves for a stranger. He sat on his couch and counted his breaths without counting and waited for the refrigerator to tell him when to stand. He went one more time with the camera because he wanted a thing that would outlast telling, even if no one would want to see it. The air had gone soft, the kind of softness that carried a hint of rot. He walked the gravel, and the whispering met him with what he had come to think of as a welcome. The politeness of a clerk at a counter in a place where the same faces come every morning. He set the camera on the post by the chain and pointed it down the corridor and pushed the button, and knew the small light would blink until the battery went patient and dead. He did not turn the camera around to face him. He did not want footage of the thing he had the exact measure of, which was the face that would be the end of him whether or not it wore his habits well. He went in. He did the things he had done. He placed his palm. He leaned. He watched himself be moved a moment before he moved, and held his temper in the way a man holds a board, while another man nails and tells himself he trusts the swing and will not pull away. He let the cold pass into his skin until the cold had no edge, and then he took his hand back, and when he tried to speak, a sound came, a quiet, homely sound, a clearing of the throat. The sound did not belong to his mouth. It belonged to the corridor. On a morning with rain, needle-fine and steady, the district office opened the chain to check the far camera and closed it, and went to lunch and did not open it again. The talk was that the county would decide to close the cut, and that decision, like all decisions, would be a word that did not know how to change a fact. Harlan took a late patrol. Mrs. Greer drove past and did not lift her chin, and after she was gone, he remembered that sometimes she lifted her chin and sometimes she did not, and neither meant anything beyond a human being's capacity for inconsistency. The boy's house had the curtain drawn in the window that faced the creek, and a lamp glowed behind it in a color that made Harlan think of his own kitchen when the bulb had aged to that shade where food looks tired before you set a pan on the burner. He parked and walked and crossed the bridge and stood as he had stood, a man with his hand learning the curve of a world not his. He felt the corridor close around him the way a hallway can seem to press forward when you stop and hold still and feel your body ring with your own pulse. He placed his palm, and the cold made him think of drink water from a hose in late spring when the earth has just remembered how to offer it. He put his forehead to the pail, and the press at the soft places around his eyes filled with the urging of sleep. Not the kind that refreshes, but the kind that takes. He did not fall. He did not step. He stood. He understood in that standing that he had stopped being a person who resisted and had become the small piece the corridor needed to complete its sentence. He smiled a small, homely smile, the smile a man gives a dog that will not come when called and cannot be blamed for hearing a greater voice. He thought of Miss Laureen in her chair and hoped the plant on the porch would be brought inside if a freeze surprised the valley. He thought of the boy and wished without words that the boy would come to have more voices in his life than the one in the trees. The pail gave nothing in return. It did not need to. It had him in the way a quiet room has a thought and will hold it until someone comes in and turns on a light or opens a door and changes the air. He took his hand away. He walked out. He hooked the chain. He drove back to the yard and left the keys where keys sit. He went home and ate without tasting. He stood at the window and watched the night press its soft chest to the glass. The refrigerator hummed, and his radio left on offered a man talking to an empty line and then thanking the caller for trying. He turned the radio off, and the sudden dark in the room had a weight to it, a reasonable weight, a weight he could hold. In the morning, he did not wake. He rose. He washed his face. He dressed. He locked his door and checked the knob and told himself to go, and he went. He passed the diner and the market and the school where someone had turned the lot lights off and forgotten to turn them on, and the asphalt had the kind of blue to it that makes people hush, for no reason they can name. He parked at the chain and unhooked it and stepped through. He walked the corridor, and the corridor walked him, and the whispering braided through the small spaces in his head where other things had lived, and those other things took their jackets and left without complaint. At the bend, the pail stood with its own kind of impatience, which is to say none. Harlan lifted his hand. The other hand lifted first. He laid his palm to the place where the world had given itself another surface, and this time the surface did what it had felt like it would do from the first day he had given it his attention. It yielded and took him in, not like a mouth swallowing, not like water, but like a room that has been waiting for its particular occupant and can begin its work only when he has stepped across the threshold and set his weight down inside it. There was no sound. There was only the absence of his breath in the air where he had stood. There was only the small camera on the post up by the chain, the small light blinking, the patient battery going about its business. The pail did not change shape, the corridor did not darken, the fence boards did not lean. A crow lifted from the far rail and dropped a shiny thing and then decided to pick it up again. A day later, the district office closed the corridor with new boards, not because they believed the boards would matter, but because boards are the tools offices have. Men in jackets with cautious words on the back nodded at one another over clipboards. The chain held a lock larger than the old one. The sign at the lane carried a warning phrased in the voice of the state, and the only sentence that meant anything was the one asking for patience. The camera was taken down and put in a drawer where it would lie until someone needed to justify a line item. People said a thing had happened and they were not wrong. They told it at the diner and at the market and in the line at the post office, and in the front yard with their elbows on their fences, and at the school waiting for a bell. The boys of the town went a few nights without walking in their sleep, and then one did again, and his mother moved a chair into his room and slept in it with her chin on her chest, and saw nothing and heard nothing, and woke with a line on her face that would not smooth. Mrs. Greer lifted her chin to men she knew and men she did not. The plant on Miss Laureen Ares' porch went inside when the first frost came angry and early, and it neither lived nor died, only held at a point in between as if deciding on a principle. In the apartment above the lot where the truck slept, a refrigerator hummed, and a radio set low offered static in the absence of anyone to adjust the dial. The mirror in the bathroom held the last face it had been asked to hold, and then did what mirrors do when they have no job. It reflected the room and the towel, and the light over the sink, and the empty space a man leaves when a door accepts him, and the air does not argue. Down by the chain, when the lock rattled in the wind, the whispering came only a little louder, the way a fridge sounds when you open it and then close it, and the motor takes a breath, earnest and small. On quiet evenings, if you stood in the right spot and did not pretend you were doing anything else, you could hear it speak in the language of the living, and the not even if you had no words to answer back. It did not ask you to. It told you what it tells. That the path you cut will call you by your name, and the name it uses will be the one you have used on yourself each morning in the mirror. And that there are doors without hinges and mirrors, without glass, and breaths that do not belong to the air. And once you learn the tune, it plays whether you mean to hum along or not. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more content. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Feel free to leave a comment below with your thoughts or questions. I love hearing from you. Until next time, take care and stay awesome.